Welcome back to Mighty Habits, everybody. I'm Steven, and today we'll be looking at a book that's been making some serious waves, still beating. It's by Jennifer Hartmann.
Yeah, it seems like it's really hitting a nerve with people. Steven, some are loving it, some not so much.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Why one book, gets such different reactions from people.
Well, Still Beating does deal with some pretty intense themes. Um, you know, Real life serial killers.
Okay,
Drama.
not exactly a lighthearted read,
No, definitely not a beach read.
but that's what makes it so fascinating to me. You know, it's this kind of heavy subject matter, but it's not getting universally glowing reviews. There are just as many people who just don't seem to be into it.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head, Steven. It's a polarizing book, to say the least.
Yeah, and that's what we want to unpack today. What makes a book so divisive? Why do some people love it while others just can't seem to get into it?
It's like some people love spicy food and others can't handle the heat.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So is it the ingredients themselves, the elements of the book, or is it the way they're combined that makes it so polarizing?
I think it's a mix of both the subject matter, of course, but also the author's writing style, the characters' choices, the pacing, how the whole story unfolds.
So with Still Beating, we've got these elements of darkness intensity.
Hmm.
But how is Hartman presenting them? Are we talking Dostoevsky level realism, or is it more like, just shock value? That's what I'm really curious about.
And that's where I think those differing opinions come in. For some readers, a book that delves into the darker side of humanity,
Yeah.
that explores those psychological complexities, even the gruesome details, can be really engaging.
They might see it as like unflinchingly honest a way to kind of confront the shadows of the world that we live in.
Exactly. But for others, it might be too much. They might find it gratuitous, disturbing, just not an enjoyable read.
Yeah, and I think everyone has their own personal preferences when it comes to reading.
Yeah.
Some people want intensity and others want escapism. But I also think there's something to be said for how those dark elements are handled. You know, like a book can have violence, trauma, disturbing characters. But if it's done with skill, if it serves a purpose in the story, it can be really impactful.
Like The Kite Runner, for example. Incredibly difficult themes, but so emotionally resonant and powerful.
Right. That's a great example of darkness done, right? But when does it cross the line? When does it become too much just gratuitous or exploitative?
I think that's a key difference, Stephen. Does it feel integral to the story, or is it just there for shock value? Like, is it just trying to manipulate the reader's emotions without really adding anything to the narrative?
Yeah, it's like that difference between a horror movie that uses suspense and atmosphere to build genuine fear and one that relies on just jump scares and gore. One sticks with you and the other just makes you feel kind of grossed out.
Exactly. It's about the intention behind it and how it's woven into the story and whether it ultimately serves a purpose beyond just trying to shock the reader.
So with Still Beating, we've got this mix of elements that's clearly sparking a lot of debate. But how are they actually playing out in this story? What's actually happening. That's what we need to unpack.
So let's look at some of those clues and see if we can figure out what's going on.
All right, so clue number one, getting it right on the first try. What could that even mean in the context of this story? Is it a character? A relationship? A crime? So many possibilities.
Yeah, each possibility leads to a whole different interpretation, too. Is it a positive thing, this getting it right, or is there a darker side to it?
Right. What if it's hinting at an obsessive personality? Someone who needs to be in control and plan every detail. That could definitely lead to some tension and conflict.
Absolutely. And then we have the mention of a real serial killer. That's not something you see in every book, and it immediately injects this sense of danger.
Right. Suddenly the stakes are real. It makes you wonder how the other characters are impacted by that, how it shapes their choices and how they see the world.
It definitely raises the stakes. And don't forget the mention of therapy.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Therapy. So that tells us someone's dealing with some pretty heavy stuff.
All right. Likely as a direct result of the events of the story.
So we've got a potentially obsessive character, a real-life serial killer, and someone who needs therapy. This is shaping up to be a pretty intense read.
It's got all the makings of a gripping psychological thriller, but whether it delivers on that promise is the real question. And to answer that, we need to dig a little deeper into these characters and figure out what makes them tick.
All right, so let's do it. In part 2 of our deep dive, we'll be exploring the characters of Still Beating and seeing how their actions and choices might be contributing to those wildly different reader reactions. Stay tuned. #TTS, the Deep Dive episode 2025-0103, part 2 of 3.
Welcome back to Mighty Habits, everyone. We're continuing to unpack Jennifer Hartmann's Still Beating, a book that's as thought-provoking as it is divisive.
It really is like we're putting together a puzzle,
Yeah.
trying to figure out what makes it tick. We've got those clues, getting it right on the first try, the serial killer, the therapy sessions. It's all very intriguing.
Each clue gives us a little more insight into the characters and what's driving the story. Maybe we should start with that first one, getting it right on the first try. I mean, what does that even mean?
Right, it could suggest a character who's really meticulous, maybe even a bit obsessive about getting things perfect.
Like maybe they have this need to be in control, plan every little detail.
Yeah, it reminds me of the talented Mr. Ripley.
Mhm.
Tom Ripley, that character. He's always scheming, always trying to create this perfect life for himself, even if it means doing some pretty terrible things.
Oh, that's a great comparison. Ripley's need for control, his desire to get it right, it definitely fuels his darker impulses.
Totally. So maybe Still Beating has a character like that, someone who's driven by this need for perfection, but it leads them down a dangerous path.
It's possible. But then that makes me think about the overall score the book got, which wasn't that high. Readers tend to like characters who are flawed, you know? Yeah. Complex.
Yeah, that's true. So maybe the way this getting it right thing is handled is just not that well done.
Yeah. Maybe the character comes across as too one-dimensional, you know? Not enough depth or internal conflict to make them really compelling.
Yeah, like maybe their motivations aren't clear or their actions just seem too calculated. It's missing that human element that makes you empathize with a character even when they're making bad choices.
Exactly. And that brings us to the serial killer. I mean, just having a serial killer in the story automatically raises the stakes.
Oh, for sure. It creates this sense of urgency and danger, and it often forces the other characters to really confront their own morality.
Like in Silence of the Lambs, Clarice Starling's whole pursuit of Buffalo Bill, it's not just about catching him, it's about her facing her own fears and the darkness that exists in the world.
Right. So how does the serial killer fit into Still Beating? Is it just a plot device to create suspense, or is there something deeper going on?
That's the question, isn't it? Does it force the characters to grow and change, to make difficult choices?
And then there's the therapy clue.
Yeah.
Someone is definitely dealing with some heavy emotional baggage as a result of all this.
Yeah. Yeah, but who is it? And what are they struggling with? Guilt, trauma, the realization that the world isn't what they thought it was.
It reminds me of the girl on the train,
Yeah.
you know? Rachel, the main character, she's an alcoholic and her narration is really unreliable. And that's a big part of what makes the book so interesting.
Right. So in Still Beating, is the therapy just a way to tell the reader what the characters are feeling, or is it integrated into the story in a way that feels real and insightful?
Yeah, because if it's just telling and not showing, then it loses its impact.
It's all about finding that balance, you
Right.
know? Giving the reader enough information, but also letting them draw their own conclusions about what's going on with the characters.
So we've got these intense elements, these complex characters, but something's just not clicking for some readers. What is it?
Maybe it's the way everything comes together, you know?
Mm-hmm.
The pacing, the writing style, the characters' choices, are they believable? Do they make sense?
Those are great questions. And to answer them, I think we need to look at the overall structure and execution of the story. So in the final part of our deep dive, we'll be tackling just that. Stay tuned. Hashtag TTS, the deep dive episode 2025-0103, part 3 of 3.
Welcome back to Mighty Habits, everyone. It feels like we've been going around and around with Still Beating, trying to figure out what makes it work for some readers and not for others.
It's definitely a puzzle, isn't it? We've talked about those intriguing clues, the characters with all their complexities and those dark themes that run throughout the book. But the big question remains, why is it so polarizing?
Right. Some people can't put it down and others just can't seem to get into it. And I think it might all come down to execution, how well those dark elements are handled, how well the whole story is put together.
Yeah, like too much darkness and it becomes overwhelming, but not enough and it falls flat.
Exactly. So let's talk about structure and pacing, Does the story keep you hooked? Is there a sense of momentum as you're reading?
Like in Gone Girl, for example, that book is full of twists and turns, keeps you guessing the whole time, and the pacing is really relentless.
Yeah. A well-paced story is so important. It keeps you engaged and invested. But if it's uneven, if it drags in some places and then rushes through others, it can really throw you off.
And then there's the writing style itself. Does the author's voice pull you in? Do you feel transported to another world?
Like Donna Tartt in The Secret History, her writing is just beautiful, it's so immersive. It creates this whole atmosphere.
Yeah, it's like magic. How a good writer can do that.
Yeah.
But if the writing isn't good, it can really ruin the whole experience.
And we can't forget about the characters. We've talked about how complex they are, but do their actions make sense? Do they feel real?
Like Amy in Gone Girl. She's a really messed up character, but you understand why she does the things she does. There's a logic to it, even if it's twisted.
Right. Compelling characters have to be believable even when they're doing bad things. Their choices have to make sense within the context of their personality and the story.
So maybe that's part of the problem with Still Beating. For some readers, maybe the characters just don't feel real enough or their actions don't make sense.
It's possible, and it goes back to that balance between darkness and execution. A book can have all these dark elements, but if they're not handled well, it just won't work.
It's like a recipe. You need the right ingredients, but you also need to know how to combine them in the right way to create something delicious.
Exactly. And that's the challenge of writing, isn't it? Finding that balance and creating a story that resonates with readers.
Well, we've definitely had a lot to think about with Still Beating. It's a book that will stay with me for a while, I think.
Me too. It's a reminder that even with difficult topics, there are ways to tell a story that is both thought-provoking and engaging.
So to our listeners, if you're looking for a dark and twisty read that will challenge you, then Still Beating might be for you. But if you're looking for something a little lighter, well, there are plenty of other great books out there waiting to be discovered.
And be sure to join us next time for another deep dive into the world of books and ideas. We'll be exploring all sorts of fascinating topics, so subscribe to Mighty Habits and stay tuned.
Happy reading, everyone.